So, essentially today we're going to talk about two different approaches that we did, each one in a different study, to audit Facebook's political ad policy enforcement. Now, in my case, I started working on these things around 2017 with respect to political ads. And at that point, it was all the rage, all the aftermath of the 2016 US presidential election. You might remember scandals like, for example, the fact that you had fake news on political ads and like completely made up facts that were featuring as political ads. And I don't know if you recall at that point, for example, Facebook was not banning these ads because it was comparing this to censorship, which was kind of controversial also at the time. Also, you had other serious stuff, like, for example, foreign interference in elections. I don't know if you recall, but at that point, there was some kind of Russian-based company called the Internet Research Agency that sent a lot of ads that targeted US users on topics such as, for example, securing borders, about LGBT issues, or about, for example, ads that were comparing Hillary Clinton to Satan and Jesus to Donald Trump. These ads have been studied, and they were shown that they were very effective. They had 10 times the average click-through rate compared to normal political ads. They had content on polarizing topics, as you can see, and they were targeted over a very large span, like over 2 years. And they made use of all the micro-targeting that Facebook was enabling them. Like, for example, they would target users interested in African American history, Latin hip-hop, or even attributes that existed then at Facebook, like black nationalism. So, yes, that was one other thing. And there were also other scandals you might remember, for example, the Cambridge Analytica scandal, etc. So, we wanted to work on these things. The first thing that we wanted to define is essentially what is a political ad. And that's not a very clear question. In the case of all these things in social media, the definition is left to each platform on its own, and they decide what it is. In the case of Facebook, in 2018, a political ad was an ad that was made on behalf or about a current or former candidate for public office or a political party. It was about some type of elections, referendum, etc. It related to national legislative issues. All these are ors, not and. So either of these clauses would qualify for a political ad. It's regulated as a political advertising. And the last part was if it's related to issues of public importance, which is a very broad definition because everything can be an issue of public importance. These days, Facebook has made this list a bit narrow, so you see that there are changes also in these things. Now it's a bit more compact. This very broad definition about any social issue has been removed, and it has been replaced by something that says about social issues in any place where the ad is being placed. And then they give a list of social issues per country. So you see that this type of thing is kind of left to the platforms on their own to decide. On the other side, the oversight falls also to the same advertising platforms. Essentially, even today, let alone in 2018, there was not a really up-to-date legislation for these things, and everyone was making their own policies. In the case of Facebook, political ads could only be sent by advertisers in the same country as the targeted users. I guess that was a response to all this scandal with the foreign interference. They needed to verify their accounts, which usually requires some kind of national identification. And they needed to have a paid-for-by disclosure, which shows who pays for this campaign, which campaign it belongs to. Another big thing then, which was kind of a breakthrough, was that Facebook offered an ad library where users could historically look at all the political ads that were posted on the platform. While this was definitely a move forward, it was also a bit controversial, and it received a lot of criticism then, mainly because of the huge data asymmetry. Essentially, Facebook was allowing users to target with tons of features. More than 250,000 attributes were detected then. And attributes you can see, like, for example, anti-abortion movements. And I had even found attributes like fascism at some point that were running. Usually they're curated, and sometimes they get removed and they get updated. On the other hand, in the political ad library, you could see only information about the cost of an ad and the age, gender, and location that it was targeted. So there is a huge asymmetry and usability in these things. However, recently there has been some improvement. Now you can see some aggregated statistics about attributes that were being used, just not on a per ad basis, so per advertiser basis. At least it's a move forward. Another thing that is left to the platforms to figure out is the enforcement policy. Essentially how to catch ads that are in fact political, but they were not declared as such. When I was working in these things a few years ago, there was not a lot of information on how this thing is enforced. And as you will see in my study, you will find examples that they could have been easily been detected, but they were not detected. Now it seems that we know more things about that. There seems to be a largely automated detection of political ads, like this here, for example. And essentially, what Facebook does is that it disables the ad and retroactively puts it in the ad library. However, this process ends up to having many missing information. Like, for example, if the advertiser did not put who paid for this ad, this never appears anymore in the library, and this information is lost forever. So, to sum up, as we see that there are a lot of places where there is a lot of leeway, and there can be many things that can be improved, and essentially, things are a bit opaque and are left on the platforms. So what we wanted to stress at that point, and we wanted to create, is some kind of external auditing mechanism for political ads and how Facebook and every other platform enforces their rules for that. So now let's go, yes, that was, so now let's go to two different approaches to do that. In my case, this corresponds to a paper we wrote, which was presented at WWW 2020. Now, in our case, the landscape was that we wanted to detect political ads for the 2018 presidential election in Brazil, because we're collaborating with some Brazilians at that point. And our solution was to essentially build an independent auditing system that enables the participation of the society to solve this problem. Essentially, we ask users to donate their data, and with this data, we use them in order to detect political ads. We did that with a tool that I developed at that point called Ad Analyst, which was essentially a Chrome and Firefox extension, which was, unlike the ad blockers, it was trying to detect ads, in this case, on Facebook. And we were collecting ads on Facebook and the explanations that users receive about these ads. And we did several more studies with this tool. And actually, right now, the tool, I have left this development tool to the team now. So this tool was not really maintained, but I think during this month there will be an updated version. So if anyone wants to look at their ads on Facebook, if they don't block them, they can have this tool to get some more transparency. On the other side, after we detected the political ads, we gave the users back a political ad detector for the Brazilian elections. Essentially, we had an application like the Facebook ad library with the political ads that we detected on the platform. Unfortunately, this link is now defunct because a lot of years have passed since the elections in Brazil, but now our collaborators there are preparing a new one for the new elections. Another thing which was a very big challenge, especially in a work that is a collaborative work and requires the participation of society, is to get users. In our case, we did many articles in newspapers, especially Brazilian newspapers, to highlight the issue and advertise our tool. And even our collaborators in Brazil presented something in the Brazilian Senate about political ads. And we garnered some publicity. And with this, we managed to have around 2,000 users that volunteered to install our extension, which is something that allowed us to move forward. So overall, we collected from Ad Analyst around 240,000 ads from 40,000 advertisers, covering both the pre-electoral and the electoral period in Brazil. On the other side, we also collected some ads from the Facebook ad library, which were essentially all political, around 100,000 ads for the same period. Now, again, we're going a bit to machine learning. essentially, we wanted to detect political ads. And how do you do this with machine learning? You have some positive examples, some political ads, and then you have some negative examples, some non-political ads, and then you use some kind of supervised machine learning algorithm for that. In our case, we operationalized Facebook definitions of 2018 to what is a political ad, and we took a random sample of 10,000 ads in Portuguese from Ad Analyst, and we asked 3 students, poor students, to label these ads, and they came out that 233 political ads were in Ad Analyst at that point. Where these ads obviously were not enough to train something, but that's why we have the ads from the political ad library. These are essentially compliant advertisers, and they're a very rich data source to use it. So essentially, our data collection had 10,000 ads from the political ad library, plus the ads from ad analysts that were as political, and the rest non-political ads were the negative examples. Now, in order to classify, we used different classifiers, 6 different classifiers, most of them very common, like naive Bayes, logistic regression, SVMs, gradient boosting, and we also used some convolutional neural network that has been used in previous bibliography for detecting political content. For features, we just used the text of the ads. And we represented it with word embeddings, in particular word2vec. So something similar in this case. And finally, we did some type of 10-fold cross-validation for our validation. Now, what were our results? Here, you see that all of our models got really, really good accuracy, more than 92%. While this makes sense in our data set, which is like a balanced data set, in practice, you have much more non-political ads than political. So essentially, accuracy is not very meaningful when you have a setting like that. Because if you have, for example, a classifier that classifies every ad as non-political, probably it will achieve very high accuracy. So we focus on a different measurement. So we look at the true positive rate, which is essentially the recall, for 1% false positive rate. And we see that there, the CNN and even naive Bayes, which is a completely out-of-the-box solution, essentially achieve pretty high true positive rate, around 78% and 85% respectively. What does this mean in practice? It means that if you have, for example, 10,000 ads and 500 of them are political, our naive Bayes approach theoretically will correctly label 425 of them and miss the rest 75, but it will also mistakenly label 95 of non-political ads as political. That is also important why we need to have such a small false positive rate. For example, even if we had something with 100% true positive rate but 5% false positive rate, we would make 475 mistakes because most ads are non-political. Afterwards, after we had this model and this classifier, we tried to employ it in the wild. Look at the rest of our ads in Ad Analyst and see what we find there. And what we find is that we detected 835 ads that we classified as political. These ads look like this example here, some of them. This is this is actually an example which shows that very distinct on why it is a political ad. So what do we see essentially? We see that these ads are political, but they were not in the political ad library, so they were completely missed at that point. And so this also makes us wonder what else is missing from the ad library and also stresses out why we need such a system. To go a bit back, there is also another thing which was very interesting with these things. In Brazil, there were several separate rules alongside Facebook rules about what is a political ad and what it should have. And it had several rules, like, for example, that ads could be sent by candidates or political parties, which were similar to Facebook. But they also had some rules like that ads can be sent only by candidates, so not someone who is not a candidate or a party. And that all ads need to have essentially some kind of information like the tax ID of the person who is a candidate. And what we notice is that 20% of all these undeclared ads came from advertisers who were essentially not allowed by law in Brazil to post ads, so they shouldn't have sent to begin with. And another thing that we saw is that 10% of the undeclared ads had the appropriate disclaimer with the tax ID, so they were following Brazilian law, but they were not, they didn't know perhaps how to declare it in the ad library. These ads also, because they had all these things, even a very simple regular expression search or something could have detected them, which also points out that perhaps Facebook, at least in Portuguese at that point, it was not really having some very solid enforcement mechanism. Overall, what we saw in this work is that many advertisers in Brazil did not label their ads as political, and that the Facebook ad library was missing these ads. But we also saw that essentially it's kind of, you can have, with a very simple classifier like naive Bayes, if you have the correct data, you can really make something like that work. And also that you can have something work by asking users to donate the data. Even if you don't have a huge user sample, you can do something. So now that was the first approach. That's my cue for Victor to go to his part.
Hello. Okay. Okay, thank you. So now I'll present our approach that we did in our study. Let's fast forward 2 years. So the audit was done in 2020, and there are quite a number of differences between the approaches that we took, but essentially it was the same goals. We wanted to understand, does Facebook's enforcement of its political ad policy actually work in practice? So indeed, we wanted to audit the political ad policy, and for this, we did a quite different approach to data collection. So instead of crowdsourcing a small sample of data, but from real users, we went to Facebook and we collected the ads that they published, as Thanos mentioned, on their ad library, but on a much larger scale for every page that we knew to have published at least one political ad, and across the entire world. So also not only Brazil, but throughout the entire world. We collected all the ads that these pages published from a period between July 2020 and February 2021. So we covered, for example, the 2020 US presidential election and also major elections in Brazil at that time. In the end, we ended up with over 33 million ads, but a lot of these ads were actually not that interesting for us to study. First of all, there were the 4 million ads that were properly declared as political by the advertisers. So they ticked the box saying to Facebook, this ad is political. And that means that Facebook's system didn't have to do anything, because Facebook knew from the advertiser that the ad was political, so they didn't have to invoke the machine learning and get the system to decide whether it's political. No, the advertiser already ticked the box, so the system doesn't have to do anything. Then there were over 29 million ads that neither Facebook or we thought were political in nature at all. And this can happen because some companies will from time to time publish a political ad, or more likely this kind of social issue ad, let's say about the environment. But usually it's just commercial ads, and that means that they do end up in our data set, but we kind of ignore them overall. What are the interesting ads? Those are the 189,000 ads that were not declared by the advertiser. So the advertiser didn't tick the box, and upfront we don't know whether the ad is actually political or not. But then either Facebook or we determined that the ad is political in nature. And these are the ads where Facebook's enforcement system should have kicked in or actually kicked in. And these are the ads that we look at in much more detail. As a bit of a side note, in terms of data collection, I already mentioned we didn't crowdsource data. We got data from Facebook, but this ad library, it does have an API, and this is like the standard way of collecting data in bulk from Facebook, but it only archives known political ads. Facebook can only put an ad in there if they know that it's political. But that's insufficient for our auditing purposes, because we need to have the ads even if they're not political and have not yet been caught, because we kind of want to understand how long does it take for Facebook to actually catch these ads, or the ads that are actually never caught, and we want to know how many ads does Facebook system actually never catch and are never labeled as political. So we had to resort to the web portal, which does list all the currently active ads for every page on the platform. But there the challenge is that the ads disappear once they become inactive. And as you probably know, the lifetime of an ad can easily be only a few hours or even less. So we need to be quite quick in actually collecting these ads. And we also built a tool to then collect these ads, store them, and archive them for later analysis. So let's go on to that analysis. So again, we wanted to understand how well does Facebook's enforcement system work. So we need to look at the two error types that exist. And we start with what are the false positives. So these are the ads that Facebook detected. The system kicked into action. It took them down. It thinks that they're political, but then according to our analysis, they're actually not political. So they were mistakenly taken down. And for this, we used a manual annotation of 600 ads. So we had, again, poor students labeling the ads. This is a standard practice, actually. And the annotation, the goal of the annotation was specifically, are these ads in scope of Facebook's political ad policy? Because, again, the definitions change between platforms, even between people. Some people think something is a political ad, whilst others don't. But we specifically wanted to test the system, so we asked to specifically answer this question. And the result of that annotation was that 55% of the ads that were detected by Facebook were actually incorrectly detected. So here, the system thought it was political, but actually they're not political at all. And when we extrapolate this number to the entire data set, this means over 40,000 ads were actually mistakenly taken down. And these ads, they cover a wide variety of topics. There are classic commercial ads, like the car sales ads in the middle, but also a lot of health-related ads, and at the time, of course, also ads related to the pandemic, which are like beneficial messages that actually do not reach the public because they are being taken down by Facebook. And then you have like the silly examples like pie recipes, which are apparently very controversial and political. The other error type are, of course, the false negatives. So these are the ads that Facebook did not detect, that were also not declared as political, but that, according to our determination, are actually political in nature. And we established a lower bound for the number of ads that Facebook missed by using the rule that all ads from a political actor should have been declared. So what we did is look for these actors through external lists of known pages of political actors and the category that the page assigns to itself, such as political party or politician. And then we just looked at, do these pages have any ads that were not declared, not detected, but that are therefore still political in nature? And there we found almost 117,000 ads that were not declared and that also were not detected. So these were ads that Facebook's system failed to find, even though they were clearly political in nature. And these are ads from major political parties, major political candidates, also ads that usually, almost always, are like clearly political in nature. The message that they have is clearly political. So these ads should have been pretty easy for Facebook's systems to catch. As a bit of a side note, the distribution of these false negatives was quite uneven worldwide. So obviously in the US, where they mostly speak English, the models work pretty well. In the US, less than 1% of ads were actually missed. To compare with this audit from 2018, we actually see a bit of improvement with the Brazilian advertisers, so from 2.2 to 1.5. But there are certain countries, like Malaysia, all the way on the right, where up to 45% of ads were actually missed. So it seems that the systems are not able to detect political ads at the same rate with the same accuracy across the world. So to summarize, even after 2 years, even after the 2018 audit, in 2020, we still see that the enforcement is quite flawed. I highlighted classification metrics that we computed based on these false positives and false negatives. If you do not know what these are, that doesn't matter. Just know they range between 0 and 1, and 1 means that the system works perfectly and classifies everything correctly. But the F1 score of 0.29 suggests that the system does not really work that well and actually makes a lot of mistakes. Now, why might this be? Why might these systems not really work properly? We identified 5 limitations in the approach and in the way in which Facebook enforces its policies, and also make some suggestions on how Facebook could improve. And the first limitation is just the approach. I think in our audit specifically, we kind of didn't want to use a lot of machine learning while trying to evaluate these ads, because we know that automated solutions might not always work, and we see here that it seems that they do not learn certain obvious signals of the political intent. For example, the advertiser. If you only focus on the content and do not take into account the metadata, such as who is advertising, you might miss a lot of ads. So we suggest that they do this as a first step. You look at the advertiser, and in general have simple rules that are clearly enforceable and that can still complement automated review. It's of course still useful to cope with the scale, but still you can have certain clear rules like the regex that also Thanos mentioned that make it a lot easier to have an accurate model. Secondly, the consequences of running ads that are political but without properly declaring them. According to Facebook's statements, they do have a policy in place where pages that run these kind of violating ads can actually be prohibited from running ads in the future, or the pages can actually be taken down. But we do not see a lot of evidence of this happening. So either Facebook does not want to do this or is still unable to do it somehow. But this could be an effective way of actually getting advertisers to comply with the policy and actually do the right thing of declaring their political ads. Third, consistency. As I showed with the false negatives, the consistency is not there worldwide. The performance is not the same globally. And this is, of course, also a question of fairness. Every country, every community deserves secure online political speech and deserves that political ads are correctly treated on the platform. So we suggest that Facebook adapts its policies and its systems to local context. Train your model on local languages. Look at local legislation. Make sure that you're compliant. Try to work with local organizations to understand what the local issues are, what maybe local keywords are that are important in the political communication, and really integrate them into the system to make sure that this performance is equal worldwide. Fourth, the policies themselves. So, as we mentioned, there are quite lengthy definitions, they are quite vague, ambiguous. Also, when we try to do this annotation on over a quarter of ads, we still disagreed on whether these are actually in scope of the policy, are these actually political ads? And these ambiguities also complicate compliance for advertisers, because if they have a lengthy document that they have to go through with vague statements, they do not know if they have to comply, if they have to declare their ad. And it also complicates the enforcement for Facebook. If they have complex rules that they have to integrate into their system that enforces their policies, it is more likely that the system will not work properly. So we suggest that they clarify the policies, simplify them, so that this compliance and enforcement becomes much easier. And finally, Facebook emphasizes transparency as a solution for online political advertising because it allows people to look at the ads, see who is publishing ads, and then hold people accountable. But with the bad enforcement that we showed is happening in Facebook systems, also comes bad transparency. Because as I mentioned, mainly only known political ads are being archived. And there are therefore, due to the false positives, a lot of bad ads that are actually not political, that are still polluting the data set. And there are, due to the false negatives, a lot of ads that are missing from this data set that should be there. So we advocate to just get rid of this distinction and just archive all the ads and all the metadata. And there are certain limitations and certain complications that happen because of this, but we can work with this. And by archiving all the ads and all the metadata, we can actually improve this accountability and make sure that malicious ads do not make it onto the platform as easily. Because with better transparency, better accountability can really be achieved. Because if we have access to data and we can do these kind of audits and really look at whether these systems work properly, then there becomes an incentive. Then we can hold people accountable, both the advertisers and the platforms. And once we have this, then there are incentives for the advertisers to comply with the policies, because we can see whether they do or not. And there are incentives for the platforms to start improving their enforcement, because we can see whether their systems actually work properly. And once we have better compliance and enforcement, then we actually achieve our goal of better security of these platforms and making sure that malicious ads do not appear. And in this case, it's of course also the security of online political speech, because we really want the benefits of online political advertising to start outweighing the risks and the vulnerabilities that we identified. So with that, I'd like to thank you for listening, and we'd be very happy to open the floor to questions.
Thank you. This is very interesting. Enforcement, huh? It's a complicated field. And there's clearly room for improvement on Facebook's end. Do we have questions for Athanasios and Victor, not Peter? Sorry, I had to be sad.
Hi, great talk. I was wondering, I assume you guys informed Facebook about your findings? And if you did, okay, if you did, what did they say? And were there any change in how they enforce policy ads?
From my side, I'm not really sure. I mean, I know that some of my collaborators had some meetings and they met at some point with people from Facebook, but I don't know exactly what was the feedback. But what I want to say is that it seems that there seem to be some changes over time to the platform that can be attributed to maybe some of these things, but yeah, there's not really a direct communication line or something like that.
Yeah. For us, it's also a bit of a long and complicated history. So yeah. Our study was done in collaboration with people from New York University, and in the past, they actually had a quite good relationship with Facebook, and they exchanged ideas, they made suggestions on how to improve the platform. But then they also had this kind of extension which crowdsourced ads, the ad observer, and Facebook didn't like that, and they actually sent them a cease and desist letter to take down the extension, and that kind of closed the phone lines between the two. So with this study specifically, we didn't really notify Facebook upfront. There wasn't also really a need to, because we didn't find some sort of major vulnerability on the platform and something that had to be fixed urgently. It's more of a question of policies, of what does Facebook prioritize? Do they want to invest a lot into these systems and make sure that they work properly, or they're more interested in maybe commercial interests? And is this maybe some sort of an afterthought? We don't know. But of course, they did see the results when they went public, and we had some media connections. So the journalists basically asked Facebook, what do you think? And in my opinion, Facebook had a bit of senseless arguments. They were like, oh yeah, but there are a lot of well-declared political ads on our platform. Yes, there are, but the system doesn't have to do anything about those. So it doesn't say anything about the system itself. And yeah, we do see small improvements over time, but they're certainly not yet enough to actually achieve really the goals of transparency and security that we aspire.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so funnily enough, I had exactly the same question. So thanks for asking that. I have a second one, which I can now ask. It relates to false positives, and I understand that it can be very tricky to say this is a political ad and this is not. But the cases that you showed, Victor, in your presentation show really odd examples that were flagged positive. The recipe, I think one was a car seller. Do you have any hypothesis why those ads get flagged positive, even though there's not even normal room for interpretation how that could be?
Mm-hmm. Not really, especially the commercial ad surprises. So what we did see in a few cases, but maybe 5 or 10%, is that there were certain keywords that might suggest why Facebook's system flagged these, some shop which was in a street named after a mayor, and then the word mayor is there, and then the system flags this. But this was not the majority of these ads. So we actually don't really know. Probably it's just the model picking up on something. These models are, of course, also certainly to us black boxes. We don't know what they do. We don't know what their inputs and outputs are. So it's very difficult for us to tell why this is. And again, there's no transparency. Like if there would be a label that says like this ad was flagged because of the photo or the text or this or that, then we could know. But now we basically don't have a clue.
That also raises the follow-up important issue of how all these auditing systems need to have transparency. And they need to be, it's perhaps better to be a bit open sourced or something like that, because like that, people can understand how they work better instead of being completely black boxes. Yeah.
There are a few other questions. Go ahead.
Yes, okay. Facebook and all is one of the social media platforms. Do you also apply this sort of research to other social media platforms?
Well, to advertise a bit our work now. No. In my institute, we collect data from basically...
I think it's the two catch boxes too close.
From basically every social media, and we try to do different things. Like, for example, right now I'm working a lot on TikTok data, for example. Yeah, so in general, you need to do this for all the social media. But in terms of like academic papers and stuff like that, the thing we're discussing, usually you focus on the bigger one, and then you hope also that the community will catch on, and other people can also, since there is the methodology now to use it, they can use it. Especially when you're talking about collaborative ways, because then you need to recruit users as well, so there is this difficulty.
And the second element is actually, in credit to Facebook, they have one of the best and most advanced policies. So it is actually like very clear what they consider a political ad or not. And they have like the most elaborate transparency. They have this archive. They do put in effort to make data available to us. That's not the case for some of these other big platforms. So it's also much easier for us to study Facebook as a subject. And actually, it allows us to really understand how their system works.
Is there no rules and regulations and a carrot and a stick that you can say, okay, you have to do this, otherwise you get a fine for $1 billion or so? They talk about billions, so they're not impressed with a couple of thousands.
Coming up. So in the US, there are now proposals for legislation that would really require transparency into ads and political ads. There the issue is that sometimes they only say for like really academic researchers, but we really want this to be open to journalists and non-governmental organizations and even like just the public, because everybody deserves to have transparency. And also in Europe you have the Digital Services Act, which has like an addendum which also focuses on political ads. So people are working on this. Just the issue with legislation is it always has to catch up, and by the time the legislation has been written and voted, it's already 3 years too late. So it's always a bit of an issue. So it's also a bit to these platforms to take their own responsibility, which again they do to an extent, but it's also for them that they have to take the responsibility of self-regulation, like the oversight of their own platforms.
The sample that you used, so the ads that were categorized political or not political, was this purely automated on Facebook's side, or also sometimes based on user reports, because those are then categorized later by people, not machines, right? So they have these big centers.
I think as far as we know, both. And even like a third option where the automated model says, I'm not sure, so I'll have a human review it. But again, we literally have those 3 sentences, and we don't know how often does that happen, how many user reports are there, are these user reports still being vetted or not. So we can only say one of the 3 or either or, but we can't say like how many or how important these different paths are.
Other questions? All right, yes. Yep.
Are you going to do any stats for the 2022 and 2024 elections? So the midterms in the US and 2024 US elections?
Not yet, because they haven't happened yet.
But it's coming. We know it's coming, I guess.
Yeah. I think in our case, the study would be quite difficult to repeat at the moment, because the data collection that we had to do, the pipeline is not really able to work anymore, because Facebook is just like applying more and more restrictions on being able to collect the data. So it's quite difficult for us to actually repeat that study. But I think in general, a lot of researchers are looking into like the different patterns that exist for this election and the upcoming elections. Yeah.
Similarly, for a collaborative method where you get the data from Facebook and stuff like that, you always have the challenge that usually these platforms don't really like you when you take the data, and they really, really try to make it much more difficult. During, for example, my PhD that I was working on such stuff, I had to change the way I detect ads and some things like 5, 6, 7 times, sometimes on weekends where otherwise I wouldn't be able to collect data. At some point, I had started like reverse engineering the Facebook code behind because everything was going like much more automated. It was not just a sponsored tag that you can just detect it easily. So essentially, you need also constant maintenance, and every year these things become a bit more difficult.
Yeah, if you ever want to see something funny, right-click the sponsor tag and go to developer tools and see what it actually looks like.
Yeah,
it's crazy.
Yeah.
That's our fault. Sorry for this. So I was going to ask, but do you think that the kind of farce that happened in 2016 elections could happen again, or is it there's enough scrutiny these days that it wouldn't happen to the extent that it happened there?
I'm hopeful that in the US it wouldn't happen because of all the scrutiny and all of these extra methods and how many people are looking into this stuff. But there is certainly the danger of happening in some other country where there's much less oversight. So, yeah.
All right, and I think we're also out of time. I'm sure there are more people who have questions, but good for you. We have another break coming up, so there you can just grab Victor and Thanos and just ask all your questions in person, or still via the chat if you wish from home. So thank you very much. Thanks. I learned a lot about Facebook and its work that it needs to do.